I'm not going to spend a lot of time on my introduction because Manisha did such a great job of introducing me. I just wanted to mention that I do have a blog. It's called thepangeapapers.com, and it's a WordPress blog that I started a few months ago. And my Twitter feed is @KitComGenesis. If you want to link with me on LinkedIn, make sure that you tell me that you attended the webinar so that I know where I met you. Okay. Um, Sometimes I get a lot of requests, and if I don't know where, if I haven't met somebody in person and I don't recognize the name right away, then I don't always accept. So if you want to link with me, I would love to link with you, but just let me know where you met me. So a few minutes ago, I posted in the chat a couple questions about to find out where you guys are in this whole process for controlled language and terminology management. So where are you in the decision-making process? Are you using controlled language now? Are you thinking about it? Do you just want to learn more about it? Where are you in that process? So if you want to put that in the chat window, and then I'll pause in a minute and have Manisha read to me the responses. Also, are you using a content management system, and if so, which one? And are you using XML and structured authoring as well with that? And then another question is, what are your top challenges with localization and content development? And how many languages do you currently localize into? A couple people answered this one, and it sounds like it varies from about 3 to 5. I'm turning up the volume a little bit. Hopefully that'll help. And what percentage of your customers are who speak English as their second language? Because that makes a big difference in how you communicate with your audience. If your audience is reading your content in English, but that's not their native language, then you need to write differently than if your entire audience is comprised of native English speakers. So think about those things, and then I'll have Manisha read back some of the responses in a minute. So today I'm gonna go through some definitions because I know most of you probably know what controlled language is, but there are a lot of different definitions out there, and so I want to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. Then we're going to talk about best practices and a little bit about return on investment, so for using controlled language, and then we'll hopefully have some time for question and answer session. And if you have questions, add your questions and responses to the chat window, and I'll stop periodically. So this is one of my favorite quote. I thought this was a very funny quote because terminology. Val Swisher is pretty famous in the TechCom world, global content strategy world, and she wrote a blog post not too long ago where she said terminology is like laundry. Just when you think you've got it all cleaned up, it's time to do it again, and that is so true. Because implementing controlled language should be part of that overall content terminology management and content strategy, and it's important to recognize it's an ongoing effort and not a one-off project. So that's one thing that's really important to think about. So here's a definition of controlled language. Controlled natural languages are subsets of natural controlled languages are subsets of natural languages obtained by restricting the grammar and vocabulary in order to reduce or eliminate ambiguity and complexity. Traditionally, they fall into two categories: those that improve readability for people, so non-native speakers, and those that enable reliable automatic semantic analysis of the language, in other words, machine translation. Most controlled languages initiatives have a base dictionary of about 10,000 words. Verbs are especially restricted because they're the key to understanding a sentence. If I know 50 vocabulary words, So I know the technical names of things, but I don't know any verbs in a particular language. I won't be able to understand a sentence. But if I know the verb, I can sometimes guess what the technical word means based on that structure, based on the composition of the sentence and the grammar. So that's something to really think about. That's why one of the reasons that controlled language exists, or how they decide to make one. So let's see. I'm going to give you a little bit of a history, and then I'll pause for Manisha to read back some of the chain of the information you've just posted. So, brief history of the controlled language movement. It started out in the early 1900s with basic English, which was a smaller subset of English. And then in the 70s, Caterpillar Equipment Company built their own version of controlled language because they were translating a lot into other languages and they were finding it was costing them a lot of money. This is in between the 70s to the 90s, several other initiatives kind of arose and then gradually kind of distilled down into the most popular one right now is the ASD ST100, which was originally done for the aerospace industry in 1989 is when it started, because as you know, no matter where you fly in the world, everything is in English. So the pilot has to be able to talk to the air traffic controller in English. The mechanics have to be able to do the repairs and understand the English documentation. And so that's why this particular flavor of controlled language came about. So the term controlled language is kind of that umbrella term for a restricted vocabulary in a particular language. And then there are all these different flavors of controlled language. So ASD, Simplified Technical English, is one specification. Caterpillar Technical English is another specification. ILSAM is another specification. So there are several different flavors of controlled language. And so you kind of need to think about which one's going to work best for you. So Manisha, can you tell me who has responded so far, and and what their responses were? I think you're on mute.
Um,
Okay, so there's a wide variety of regularly scheduled program. Thanks, Manisha. It sounds like everybody's doing a little bit different thing, and ranging from like 2 or 3 languages to many languages. So that's pretty typical, depending on the size of the company and where you're selling your stuff, your products overseas. So here's some context about why this is important. English, this is I saw this on a t-shirt at a gaming convention. English doesn't just borrow from other languages. It follows them down dark alleys, knocks them over the head, and rifles their pockets for loose grammar. So what this is saying is that the English language steals from other languages. While it's a Germanic language, 70% of the vocabulary is based on the French, thanks to the Norman influence in England. And English is also, as you all know, the international language of business. And so because of this, new words creep into our vocabulary every day. So from abacus, which is a Latin word, to zeitgeist, which is a Germanic word, and everything in between. If you like playing with words, Forgotten English is a great book. It's a lot of fun. There are a lot of words in there that we don't use very often anymore, but it's a lot of fun to read it and see the words that used to be in very common usage that we just don't use that often anymore. So this is a really interesting statistic. I just looked this up. So as of January 1st this year, the English Global Language Monitor says that estimates that there are about 1,025,109.8, so 110 words in the English language. Now, this statistic includes all of the words, the jargon, the idioms, word variations, and so on, neologisms. Most dictionaries only contain about 200 to 250,000 English words, the ones that are used most commonly. The complete Oxford English Dictionary contains about 600,000 words. So if you're thinking about some controlled language standards, different ones, depending on where they were developed, use different dictionaries. In the case of ASDSTE 100, it uses the Merriam-Webster dictionary as its reference dictionary because it's based on American English. Are you having trouble hearing me?
No, everything is fine.
Okay. Okay. Um, Yeah, I don't know how you get a 0.8 of a word either. I thought that was very strange, but I think it's just they have an algorithm that they ran automatically, and that's where that came in. So I think it's kind of weird too. The Google and Harvard combined to do a study to validate this number. So they were within about 0.12 or 0.21% of this number. I think they came up with 1,022,000, which is within the percentage that indicates scientific significance. So it was within the margin of error basically. So I thought that was very interesting. But what's important about this is that English has more, because we borrow from other languages, have more words in our language than most other languages do. And so if you talk, I tried to find some statistics on Hindi and Bengali, but I didn't find numbers of words in those languages. But in French, depending on whom you ask, the Académie de Français dictates which words get included as French words. So they could be between 400 and 500,000. Depending on which version of Spanish you're talking about, it could be 250 to 300,000. In Chinese, 85 to 100,000. And it's for this reason that controlled language is necessary, because one word in English might not have an equivalent word in another language, and all of you speak more than one language, I think. All of you speak English and probably at least one other Indian language, if not more. So you know that when you're learning a new language, you have to sometimes talk around a concept if you don't have a word for that in the language. So that takes up more space. One of Another fun book that talks about linguistics is called The Meaning of Tingo, and I'll send Manisha a list of all of these. Um, the Meaning of Tingo is a fun book, but it's about untranslatable words in different languages. So one of the examples I gave, and I can't even pronounce it because it's like 12 syllables long. It's a word in a Tierra del Fuegan language, which is a South American language, that means basically that look when you look at somebody and you kind of like them, like you like them, but you're too shy to say. We don't have a word for that in English, but they have a word for that look in that South American language, which I thought was really interesting. Those kinds of words and those kinds of concepts kind of tell you what's important to a particular culture as well. So it's really important to um, to think about how the words in other languages translate into English and vice versa. So out of 6,909 approximately living languages, 6%, so only 415 are spoken by a million or more people. So 415 out of 6,909 languages are spoken by a million or more people. And this accounts for 94% of the world's population. So as you can see that in terms of total number of native speakers, English is only third on the list. Hindi is close behind, and Bengali is number 7. And most of the top 10 languages probably count for most of the world's population. So English, though, as you know, is the most common second language with an estimated 1.5 billion total speakers who speak some form of English, whether it's UK English, American English, Australian English, or Indian English, or some other flavor of English. And at some level of fluency. So the ratio of non-native speakers to native speakers is about 3-to-1. And that has implications as well, because a lot of times non-native speakers want to read, are able to read the instructions in English, and so if the translation isn't good quality, they'll know, right? Because they can read their native language and they can read English at some level of fluency and know whether that's good or not. So these are some other reasons why having a controlled vocabulary is helpful. To get basic, so even though it's the most commonly spoken second language, English, and the de facto language of business, fluency ranges greatly. So a basic oral level of comprehension is about 2,000 words. This is about the level of a 2 or 3-year-old. Basic written English would be like a short children's book, a picture book. Basic technical English is what you need in order to read basic instructions and comprehend a basic user manual. And that, in addition, assumes that some of those words are specific to that technical discipline. University level is conversational and more abstract concepts and can read novels or newspapers and some textbooks. Fluency is about 20,000. So that means that you can read and write, speak and comprehend the language. You might have some trouble with idioms, however, and professional translators typically have more than 20,000 words. So professional translators typically have close to native fluency in a particular language. So native speakers or average adults have no 30 to 40,000 words. However, I would say most technical writers, because we like words, and most translators have a higher vocabulary in their native language. Are there any questions so far? Not seeing any. Okay, don't forget, if you have questions, go ahead and type them into the chat window, and I'll stop periodically. Controlled language. Okay, so one of the things is that the Oxford English Dictionary defines the 500 most common used words in the English language have an average of 23 different meanings. So here's some examples of some just very simple verbs in English, and they have that many different definitions in the Oxford English Dictionary. So you can imagine how difficult it is for a non-native speaker to figure out, without enough context, to figure out what that verb means or what the terminology means. So that's why controlled language initiatives strive to enforce that one word, one meaning rule, so that only one definition of these words is allowed in that controlled language. And this is especially important with verbs because, again, if you think about what are the first verbs that you learn when you're learning a new language? I am, I have, I want, I need, I do, I make. Those are all the basic verbs in a language. And if you know those verbs plus who, what, when, where, why, and how, and maybe a few vocabulary words, you can get your basic needs met, right? So all of a sudden you can construct a sentence and ask questions in that language. But if you only know a couple of words but you don't know the verbs, it's very difficult to get your needs met. And here is what happens when you have translations gone wrong. So given that given that the number of English words that are available, it's no wonder that translation goes awry, right? The problem is that these poor translations not only cost money, not only in lost reputation or trust, but they also increase liability. And this is especially important in the U.S. For example, there's a lot of lawsuits that happen because they don't, if something goes wrong and equipment breaks or the warning label is wrong. And in some other countries, that's also a problem. So, when we travel or we surf the internet, we laugh at these poor translations, and at the lowest level, they're amusing or confusing. And in the middle, it causes product branding issues. But at the worst case scenario, they can cause serious problems for the company, or they can cause somebody to hurt themselves. This is a fire extinguisher, not a hand grenade. So it's for putting out fires. If somebody thought that was a hand grenade, they're going to respond to that differently, right? It's not clear from this whether you're supposed to whether there's a fall whether there's a drop off or whether which means a falling risk perhaps, or whether you're supposed to duck, right? And duck down and hide. And then of course you have the product branding issue where a computer mouse is the name. This was a Chinese company called their computer mouse Sperm, which is a bit embarrassing when you go to sell that into an English speaking company, because that maybe doesn't have the meaning that they wanted to impart to a computer mouse. So here are a couple of examples of the consequences of translations gone wrong. Inconsistencies cost money. This transformer blew up and cost the company $5 million because of badly worded and confusing documentation. So the guy who was maintaining this inserted an electrical part in the wrong place, and it caused the transformer to blow up. And it probably caused a power outage in that area as well. Everybody is familiar with the Mars Climate Orbiter from a few years ago. This is a very sad case. One engineer used metric measurements in the design, and another engineer used imperial measurements in the design. And the guy whoever somehow in the software code, they didn't convert the metric to imperial or the imperial to metric properly, and that's what caused the climate orbiter to fail. So it smashed into the planet instead of reaching a safe orbit, to the cost of $327.6 million US. That's a lot of money to waste, and many years of planning. This, I think, was like a 10 or 15-year planning process. So now that you know why you want to have controlled language and why you want to use it, let's talk about some things that you need to make sure you have in place to allow you to be successful in implementing a controlled language. The biggest thing is management and international office buy-in, because this is something that requires dedication and time, especially in the beginning when people are learning how to do this. in the, learning how to write in this new way. It requires the writer to think differently about their work, because instead of using whatever word comes to mind, they have to make sure that that word fits within the controlled vocabulary. And it's also not a one-off process. This is something that's an ongoing effort and really should be managed at the program level, not the project level. So if management isn't bought in, doesn't agree with the necessity of doing this, you're going to have difficulty getting all of the development teams using controlled language properly. And really, if it's not, it can't just be the documentation team doing it. It needs to also be the product development team using controlled language in order for it to be effective. You can start with the documentation team, but ultimately everybody who has content that gets translated needs to start considering how to use the controlled language properly. So keeping that in mind, you need to have a cross-functional team, because every team member has a different idea about how, a different perspective on the product and on the content, and will bring different skill sets to that discussion. So if you use their expertise with, the product developers know the product really intensely well, the documentation people know the users really well, the content marketers or the marketing team know the locales and do the market research. If you combine those key people into a team that and use their expertise, you can inform your decisions and your decisions about terminology. You need to find out what their pain points are in terms of the process and in terms of using controlled language. And 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 see if you can help fix them. So you need to break down some of those silos that happen between departments and between teams, and make sure that those key stakeholders understand how important this is. The other thing that you need to also do as part of this cross-functional team is set up kind of an editorial control board, where that board is senior technical people who understand the importance of terminology and can discuss and agree on what that controlled vocabulary should be. And I would recommend starting with one of the existing controlled language initiatives and then using that as the base and then modifying it as appropriate for your particular use. Another key is to plan your transitions and document your processes, because one of the things that technology doesn't cause most failures of new initiatives. It's poor planning or people change management issues. That's the reason for most failed initiatives. So if you document the processes, as one of my bosses told me a long time ago, if it's not documented, it doesn't exist, and it didn't happen. So by documenting your processes and following them, that allows you to be more consistent and to repeat the process and repeat your success. It also allows you to identify the areas where the process isn't actually working for you, so that you can make modifications as you go. One of the key things, and this is something that tends to happen when people first get into the process documentation side, they get excited about documenting the processes and kind of forget that the purpose of a process, a consistent process, is to improve your efficiency and to support your ability to get work done efficiently. And if that process is not allowing you to do that, then you need to change the process. So that's really important to keep that in mind all the time when you're doing it. You need to modify the process or scrap it if it's not supporting what you need to do. And you need to review your processes fairly on a regular basis, at least annually, to ensure that they're still working for you. Because as new tools and new technology come into play, you may not need a process anymore, or you may need to make adjustments. So I mentioned change management a little while ago. Change management and quality assurance are the two key things that are going to allow you to be successful in this. If you don't have a good change management system, something that allows you to be proactive about change management, and especially when it comes to terminology management, you're going to have issues. Okay, and you won't be successful. So you must have a good change management system. And what that looks like is that you need to be cognizant of the priority for the change. You need to have a way of prioritizing these changes. So like if somebody's going to die or equipment's going to be damaged, you need to make that change no matter where it is in the localization or content development process. If it's something that's wrong or something that just needs clarification because it's confusing, it depends on how serious that confusion is, whether it's a level 1 or a level 2 change. If it's a level 2, maybe you're not doing that at desktop publishing phase of localization. Maybe instead you're putting in a ROTA sheet or an addendum out to support that. So, and if it's like something that would just help with usability, but not really change the overall functionality of the product, maybe you wait until the next iteration if you're 3 weeks from product release and it's already with localization. Maybe you don't want to make that change just yet. And if it's cosmetic, yeah, those may or may not get changed, right? So when you go, and here's the reason that if you wait to make a change until content is in the QA stage of localization or desktop publishing stage of localization, you're costing yourself money because you're essentially having to re-input that content back through the whole process. If, on the other hand, if you sent the files to localization 2 days ago and you find a problem, you can usually stop the presses and it doesn't really cost you anything other than maybe a couple hours of time. But the later you go in that localization process when you make that change, the cost increases exponentially, and it's on a per language basis. So if it costs you $50 in the English to make that change and you're translating into 20 languages, all of a sudden that one change is a $2,000 change. So very important to think about when in the process you're making that change. And when you go to controlled language, sometimes you have an initial hit with localization because those translation memories that you have already established might have to be aligned with the new controlled vocabulary. So you might have a temporary increase in fuzzy matches, but then you should see fairly quickly a drop off if you've done it well, in the subsequent localization costs. And does everybody know what translation memory is? Just in case you don't. So translation memory is a database that basically pairs the source English with the target language. So the source English sentence, the dog jumped over the moon, in English and in Hindi would form a language pair, and that translation into Hindi or into Bengali or Spanish or German or whatever forms a language pair in the database. And so the translation memory is the combination of the source English plus that target language. So some other keys to success is templates and style guides. You need to make sure templates and style guides should be living documents. And I highly recommend, if you don't remember anything else today, get John Cole's Global English Style Guide, because that will really be helpful to you in terms of setting up your content for writing for international audiences. Style guides and templates should be living documents. So they need to be posted in a format. I like wikis for style guides because that makes it easier. John Cole, Kohl, and it's the Global English Style Guide. Um, and again, I'll send Manisha a list of the books and stuff that I mentioned so that she can pass that on to you guys as well, because I know it's hard to remember when I'm talking. So I like wikis for style guides because then that allows the whole team to contribute ideas and thoughts and clarifications and examples, and it also makes it easy to update. They need to be accessible to everybody who needs them. So if you're working with a team in India and a team in the US and a team in the UK and a team in Australia, everybody on the team needs to have access to the same information. Um, and you need a process for making changes to the style guide, because you don't, I think it's okay for people to contribute like examples that would help people or clarifications, but there needs to be some sort of control, quality control over who's adding things to the style guide and when, and so that you can make sure that you're incorporating localization needs and that you're optimizing your English content for translation. And a key point here is also that internationalization, which is the creating of the source content to remove cultural bias, so that it's easier and cheaper to localize, and using controlled language as a part of internationalization, and writing and editing for international audiences part of internationalization. This shouldn't be a separate process. It should be built into the whole design process and the product development, content development process. Terminology management should also be part of this, and should be as automated as possible. One thing to remember is that there are several tools, acrolinks. Ediplan Press has a tool called HyperSTE, which is specific for companies that are using the Simplified Technical English specification. But what those tools do is they're kind of like automatic grammar and terminology checkers that flag content that's not compliant with whatever it is that you've set up in your style guide. And what that can do is save time with the editor not having to go through and remember everything manually, and allows the editor to focus on the more important things like organization, like clarity, like the things that machines can't do for us at this point in time. Are there any questions? Doesn't look like it. If you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat. I will stop. So speaking of terminology management, here are some things that you need to think about. Editors can and should play a significant part in the role for terminology management. A lot of larger companies are starting to hire professional terminologists to help them. And this is something that should be done at the program level, or maybe even at the corporate strategy level, rather than at the project level. And the reason for that is that terminology is often shared across product lines. And if you have one team in the US, one team in the UK, and one team in India, and one team in Australia, and they're all designing different products, it's very easy for them to call the same part a different name, even though it's the same thing. So a widget should be a widget no matter what product it shows up in, right? A spanner should be a spanner no matter what product or a wrench. If you choose wrench, if you're using American English, or spanner if you're using UK English, it should be called the same thing no matter what product it appears in. And one of the key things here is that we all know that engineers like to just make things up sometimes if they don't have a system for naming things. They sometimes will get into the design and they'll just call it something random. But these terms need to be translated, and so if they're out there just making changes willy-nilly and it needs to be translated, this can cause problems for translation. So having a terminology management system that's above the project helps enforce that consistency across product lines. You need to make sure that your definitions are clear and specific and that free of tautology. In other words, don't use a word to define the word. When appropriate and necessary, you can provide examples for how to properly use the term. In-country reviewers. The in-country reviewers are the people who sit in the target locale and look at the English version and the target language version and make sure that the quality of the translation is consistent and that the ensure the quality for that local market and that there aren't any cultural or terminology or you know issues like that with the content. So getting the in-country reviewers involved early in the terminology management process allows you to engage them sooner in the process and also helps them get more ownership of the content that's coming out of localization. It's a whole nother presentation, but in-country review is one of the biggest bottlenecks in the localization process, quite honestly, because a lot of times that's not part of their job. And so incorporating them in, making it part of their job and incorporating them into this terminology management system helps with that buy-in and helps get the support that you need. And one of the other things that this really sometimes sneaks up on us, right? Because there are words, English words, that mean one thing in the U.S. and something else entirely in the U.K. or Australia or India. And so you need to make sure the terminology is being used the same way in all of those different countries. For example, there's some financial terms that are used differently in the US than they are in the UK and Australia and probably India as well. And in fact, they mean, in some cases, mean the opposite thing in one country versus the other. And so in those cases, it's really critical that you have the right definition. And in some cases have to localize the English as well. So some other keys to success, follow the principles of good technical communication, and we all know what they are, right? Know the audience, keep it simple, be concise, use active voice, be consistent, and following those principles will help get you about 75% of the way there on the internationalization and controlled language. And then the other part that gets you the rest of the way is curating that terminology and your content. Now, one of the things you might run into, especially if you're a manager or one of the senior people on your team, is that sometimes the doc teams are initially resistant to using controlled language because they feel like it will restrict their creativity. But the reality is that in order to effectively implement controlled language, you really have to be an excellent writer because you have to understand the nuances of the language enough to be able to identify which of those preferred words can substitute for the word that you initially thought of. It's a bit, you have to be thoughtful and it requires you to think differently about your writing. So it can be a bit mind-bending to constantly be trying to think of the simplest phrase and making sure that it makes sense and reads well at the same time. So one of the things, the key things about controlled language is just because it's compliant with the spec does not mean that it's quality content. So it needs to both be compliant and read well at the same time. So as Mark Twain, who's a famous U.S. American writer, once said, I would have written a shorter letter, but I didn't have time, right? The first draft is always way longer, and then we can finally, shorten things. And that's part of what you do with controlled language you'll find your writing getting shorter and tighter. So having a QA and a periodic audit, as I mentioned earlier, terminology management is an ongoing process. So in the beginning, you should conduct a needs analysis, identify, and a content audit so that you know what your major issues are with your content and with your terminology, so then you can prioritize your efforts. This is where you can also establish some of the metrics to measure the return on investment and how you're doing. Periodically, you're going to need to conduct additional audits to ensure that you're making progress and that you're completing that, to compare your current state with what your initial state was. So you want to show, managers want to see progress and continuous improvement. So if you know after the initial audit, for example, that you have a lot of problem with passive voice, maybe that's what you focus on for the next 6 months, is making your writing more active. Okay, and then you went from 60% of your sentences are passive to 10% of your sentences are passive in the same type of content. That tells your manager that you're doing a good job of implementing things and making that controlled language work for you. Because the other piece of this is that controlled language isn't just about the terminology, it's also about the grammar and the structure of the writing as well. And you can download the ASDST 100 specification so you can have an example. It's free. It's in PDF format at asd-ste100.org. So, the other piece of this is that these periodic audits also help you identify some training needs and editorial, in addition to problems, but what you're doing well is also important. So really, again, it's not just if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. If you can't measure it, it didn't happen, right? You need to be able to show the cost reduction and the improved quality. So you want to develop both quantitative measurements and qualitative measurements. So a quantitative measurement would be, we reduced our word count from 100,000 words to 60,000 words by implementing Simplified Technical English. That tells you nothing about the quality. What tells you about the quality then would be, we did a customer satisfaction survey or a usability test, and the customer using the original took 10 minutes to get through the procedure, and with the new content took 5 minutes to get through the procedure. So you want to develop both the qualitative and the quantitative measurements. You might want to reduce the number of preferential changes in terms of localization, so that you color code the review copy that shows the subject matter expert or the in-country reviewer what's already been translated and what's new in the content. And then you can measure the effectiveness of this by looking at the translation memory and seeing whether you've reduced the number of partial matches in the translation memory of 90% or better. So a 90%, 100% match means that the source English and the target language match exactly. A 90% match means that one or two words in that sentence are different, which usually means that the editor, somebody went through and edited it and they liked term A better than term B, and so they swapped them out. And they mean roughly the same thing, and so it's a preferential change, but it affects the translation memory because now the translator has to go and look at that and make sure that the context is correct for that terminology change. The other thing, managers always want to know about the money, right? Show me the money. So what is the cost benefit analysis of what you're doing? So as you make these changes, you need to really think about that cost benefit. So it costs some money in terms of time and effort to implement controlled language. Yes, I will I'll provide the slides as a handout for you guys as well. So as you make changes to existing content, you really need to think about the cost and the benefit. So the line between the two, how much does it cost versus how much benefit are you getting? And the line where those two lines meet is going to be different for every company and every stage in the process. So using controlled language is pretty straightforward. It requires the team to think about their writing and their work differently. And so having somebody come in and train them on how to do controlled language effectively will really help improve the consistency and the quality and the success of the initiative as well. And editors are in the perfect position to provide coaching to the team on these controlled languages because they see everybody's work. So they know who has weaknesses and strengths in each different way and often have a broader view of the projects. So really important to include training as part of this. So this case, Tato Press, I do a lot of work with Tato Press, and they loaned me this case study. So this shows you the potential ROI, return on investment, for implementing controlled language. And in this case, the flavor of controlled language is Simplified Technical English. So all of these numbers, I think, are actually in euros. In the source language, originally they had 5 million words. So they still have 5 million words. They reduced word count in the first instance, they reduced the word count by 15%. So what that did was it saved them and they're translating into 5 languages. This saved them 262,500 euros. In this case, they had 25% reduction in the word count, okay? And that saved them 473,500 euros in 5 languages. And this is just on one project, okay? Or one annual, I guess this was the total annual translation, okay? So almost 500,000 euros is a lot of money. And you can even see greater reductions depending on how well you implement controlled language. So this is a really key thing to keep in mind and remember for the team. Some other examples, they did a survey of their users, HyperSTE users, to show what the average benefits were. Up to 30% in cost savings on localization, up to 40% reduction in word count, and 30% reduced in product cycle time. So that means that from the time they started a project until it got released to the public, it was about a 30%, and a 40% reduction in overall documentation, plus conversion of legacy content. These are huge. And if you start putting dollars or rupees or euros to these numbers, that becomes a pretty significant, a return on investment to that bottom line for the company. And these results seem fairly typical once the team is on board with using controlled language consistently. However, it does take up to about 12 to 18 months to get the entire content curated and modified to support controlled language. Partially this is due to the way the product cycles work. And I usually recommend that you only convert legacy content if it's needed for a new product or a product update. So as it's needed again, because it's a waste of money to convert legacy content that's 10 years old that nobody's ever going to use. And this is partially due to the fact that it takes the team time to get used to writing and working in this way. I think I might have an example. I have to look at I have another slide that I might be able to show that for you. So here's a summary basically of what we've been talking about. Get buy-in from upper management, create a transition and implementation, training and change management, and I'm talking about both the human kind of change management, in other words, get your team ready, also the content ready, and build some extra time into the schedule for some of your initial projects. And then consider using some tools. So, what questions do you have? And here's my contact information again as well. So I'm pretty responsive about calling or about responding to email and things. Let me just look real quick. I think I was just looking at a slide deck yesterday that had the example of the controlled language. So I can show you that. Hang on just one second. So be thinking about some questions while I'm looking. Where is it? There it is. Okay, so here, start the slideshow. So here is an example. So the left-hand side with the yellow is an example of somebody who just wrote this without using controlled language. With on the right-hand side, you can see how much it reduced the text amount, the quantity of text by 30%. So instead of turned on, starts operation, runs through. So turned on, runs through, initialization, determine. These words all have many, many meanings. And so making them more specific. And so when it starts operation, moves inside the plunger. This movement lets the computer calculate and store the position called top dead center. So that's a way more clear than the left-hand side. Okay. So for controlled language, Acrolinks is one of the better ones. Maxit is supposed to be a grammar checker. I've never used it, so I don't know how good it is. If you're in the aeronautics industry and you're implementing ASD STE 100, which is the specification, I would recommend Tato Press's Hyper STE product because that's very simple to use. It's a plugin, a word plugin, and makes it very easy. Hyperlinks can be a little bit challenging too because it's very customizable, and because of that, it can be pretty complicated to set up. So those are the main tools. I see that I can't read the name. Kishta? Kija? Ah, are there any guides like STE 1000D for software documentation? Um, there are some ISO standards, but they're not controlled language standards. There are, as I mentioned earlier, let me just go back to my other presentation here. Let me just get to the right slide. Here we go. What is it doing? There we go. All right, now I can start it again. So going back to this slide right here, there are several different flavors of controlled English. probably the I would probably start from the Simplified Technical English and work outward. Um, but you but it's not there's some terms that are prohibited in the aeronautics specification that you actually need for software documentation. So I don't think there really is a specification that's applicable, but you can modify the existing flavors to support your initiative. Does that make sense? Let's see. Are there any other questions? The front So Mugda says, is there a basic checklist available on the internet for a writer who wants to practice controlled language as part of good writing? Yeah, if you download the ASDST 100, the first part of that specification has like a whole set of guidelines for grammar and just general writing best practices. Um, as I said before in the presentation, if you follow good tech writing best practices, you'll get 75% of the way there. And then the other 25% of that is managing the terminology. ASD STE 100. Here, I'll type it in the thing. There you go. So you should be you can download the PDF from there, and it's free. The other one, okay, so hang on, let me, so the Global English Style Guide was the other one that I mentioned. And that would be a good place to start as well, if you just want to practice good writing. And I'm just typing, oops, misspelled his name. That's just typing. And Megana says, what is the difference between minimalism and controlled writing? Minimalism is more of a design practice where you're giving the user just enough information, whereas controlled writing is more about the vocabulary. So they're related, they're not exactly the same. Anything else? Any other questions? I'm going to type the name of the other ones that I said. And forgotten. Thank you, Sir Sanjivani. Appreciate that. Oh, my nose itches, sorry. Great, thank you, Magda. Did you hear me? Oh, okay. So Megana asked again, what's the difference between minimalism and controlled writing? The difference is basically that minimalism is a design and controlled writing is more the grammar and talking and grammar and vocabulary. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. Thank you for your time today. That's great. I'm glad that it was helpful to you guys. And if you have questions, so I know sometimes when you're doing this, you go in, you think about things later. So if you have questions later, just let me know. I'm always available.
Thanks, Kit, and thanks all the participants for joining the webinar. And And also thanks to Adobe for sponsoring our webinar. It was a very informative session, and it was, I mean, uh, thanks to Kit again for taking out so much time for us and briefing us about controlled language and how to go about implementing it in our organizations. No, it was really wonderful.
Well, great. I'm glad it was helpful. I enjoyed meeting everyone and talking to you. I would love to come to India someday. So hopefully I'll get to meet everyone in person at some point. Yes, we'll be sharing the presentation.
Yeah. I'll share the recording as well with you within a week time.
All right, thanks everyone. It's now 10:30 my time, so I'm gonna go if nobody has any other questions. All right, thank you guys. Have a good night. Bye.